Hello, everyone. For this Tuesday's Theolog, we are going to talk about justice, John Brown, and violence, whether or not it ever is okay to use violence to get justice. So, as I was on my trip last week, I also, or 2 weeks ago, I guess at this point, right? Besides the arc, other highlight of my trip was being able to go to Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And for a history buff like myself, like Harper's Ferry is a great place to visit. One, it's been kept in excellent condition and you can like walk around and it's really nice. You park and they take a bus down to the actual town. And you can kind of see stuff there and it's very, very cool. But the other part of it is that it's just very important historically. So, for those of you who may not be up to snuff on your American history, or maybe you've forgotten a little bit of the things you've learned since like high school or college, or I guess maybe even elementary school and middle school, Harper's Ferry is really important because it was kind of the first warning bell that the Civil War was coming, and it kind of actually set, in many ways, the course that was going to come into the Civil War. And the reason that happened is because of a guy named John Brown. And John Brown is a very important figure at this time in American history, and he wasn't a politician. He was a kind of, I guess you want to call it like, I mean, honestly, a terrorist who believed very strongly that slavery was a moral abomination. And I agree with him and definitely on that point. But he was also a devout Christian as well, and he believed that it was his specific call from God to end slavery in the United States. And so he first became very famous for bleeding Kansas, which was Kansas was going to become a state in the United States, and you had both people from the South and people from the North coming in because Kansas was going to be allowed to vote on whether we came in as a free state or a slave state. And so you had a bunch of people just moving in, right, to just show up and vote for one way or the other. And violence broke out, and John Brown was kind of at the front of that violence, leading raids onto people who were pro-slavery and very famously hacking whole families to death and things like that. Very violent. Probably not a I don't. I want to. Being someone who is not an expert in this field, I want to be a little careful in this, but probably not an inherently violent man in the sense of like wanting to kill people, but believe that violence was the best and only way to achieve these methods, right? So he's not like a murderer. So, well, he could, yeah, murderer is probably actually accurate for what he was, but he probably wasn't like a serial killer or anything like that, right? He was motivated out of religious a belief to work out this justice in the world because slavery was such an abhorrent thing, right? So he does that in Kansas, and then he gets his idea that he is going to begin a slave revolt in the South to try and just throw over slavery in a huge violent revolution from the slaves themselves. And so he and his followers go to Harper's Ferry, which was then in Virginia, right? West Virginia hadn't broken away yet because it joined the Union during the Civil War, but the Civil War hadn't started yet. So they go to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and they take over the arsenal there. It was a big arsenal town. That was like where a lot of the weapons for the United States Army was made. So the thinking is you take over the arsenal, you arm the slaves on the plantations around, they rise up, you move out, and eventually you are able to overthrow slavery, right? So you can kind of see that. Of course, it doesn't go that way. He ends up being beaten, and many of his people, or nearly all of them, are killed. John Brown himself is hung for this act of terrorism, and and it ends up kind of galvanizing some more pro abolition forces in the North, but it really, really scares the pro-slavery forces in the South, right? People who used to believe or believed in some way that the North would, uh, stand by the South regardless of their differences over slavery and things like that, got really scared and started to believe that this is what all the Northerners wanted to do and things like that. And eventually it led to hostilities or helped, start the ball rolling. Of course, that ball had already started for many, many, many years before, but now it was picking up steam, right, as it was heading downhill. So a very important historical place. And it was interesting to go, and it's if you ever have a chance, it's really cool. One, it's picturesque and well kept, but two, there's lots of interesting stuff there. And of course, the main museum there is on John Brown, and they have a bunch of really cool artifacts that John Brown had. And the most important one, or at least the one I found most interesting, was the family Bible that John Brown had, and they had a note next to it showing that they didn't have it open, but apparently he had marked passages and things like that that were very meaningful to him from both the Old and the New Testaments. Um, but they also had a little section about how he justified his use of violence, and it comes from this story in the Gospels where Jesus is talking with his disciples, and he tells them that you should carry a sword, and Peter responds by saying, "Lord, we have two," and Jesus says that is enough, right? And no one, I'm going to be honest, from a from a theological level, a lot of people have no idea what that passage is about. They don't understand what Jesus is talking about. There have been so many different interpretations, and there is not a consensus at all. It actually is probably one of the most mysterious passages in the Gospels. And so John Brown believed that that was Jesus giving his followers the ability to arm themselves, to fight against people, and to fight for justice and things like that. Uh, and of and of course, this is kind of actually prevalent for today, because I was talking with another one of my friends who had come on the trip, and he uh, was from Zimbabwe. And for those who don't know, many people are very familiar with apartheid in South Africa, but Zimbabwe is also under apartheid. Um, and unlike South Africa, which was mostly it was ended through demonstration and Nelson Mandela and that whole story, forgiveness and things like that. The apartheid regime in Rhodesia, as it was known at the time, which would become Zimbabwe, was overthrown through violence. And so we talked a little bit about that, and just getting his thoughts on these types of things. But even today, in certain times of our culture, you'll see people make excuses, or say that violence is the only appropriate reaction to things. Not to throw something on the fire, but I think most recently this happened last summer with some of the protests. You saw this type of rhetoric leveled at why it's okay to protest and things like that. But you can also find it on other sides of the aisle, right? Like the Bundy Ranch a few years ago, where it was like the best way to fight the government was to shoot them or whatever, right? So it's part and parcel of our history on all sides, right? People will believe that violence is sometimes the only answer. Of course, you have this in other revolutionary movements around the world, like the Nazis or the Soviet Union or the communists, whatever you want to call it, right? So what do we do as Christians, right? And why do I think John Brown was wrong? Because I do think John Brown was wrong. I ultimately think that the Christian answer is the least satisfying one. And it's the least satisfying because it demands that we, like Elijah, like Job, like many others, just and like the martyrs in Revelation, sit and wait for the justice of God to come. Now, that doesn't mean we can't do anything, right? But it doesn't mean that we are given free rein to sin if we think that it'll help bring about things in the future, right? And leading a rebellion against people, killing people, even if they're not really doing anything, that is outwardly, or even if you disagree with them, just because you disagree with them, you can't just kill people, right? So sin can't be just a justifiable excuse. To do so, to that something good ultimately comes out of it. I don't find that a very compelling argument. And of course, if it's breaking the laws of God, that's really bad. So I'm not very partial to people like John Brown and others who believe that the best way to end things is with violence. And obviously, for Christians who do believe that the best way to end things is with violence, or to think that violence is an acceptable method of doing these things, I would point out that you also have to be open to your enemies doing that as well, right? A lot of people never consider that. They always consider their side as the one in the right and the one that is justifiable in violence. But I always, tell people that if you're going to excuse it, then you can't be mad when other people use violence to get their way either, right? Christians are known for our love, or we should be anyway, and the best way to show that is not through violence, especially political violence, to bring about change. So I think that we should be very careful with these types of things. I find John Brown a very fascinating character. I believe he was a Christian and is a Christian, and I'll be able to have a good talk with him about these things in new heaven and new earth. But it's just an interesting thing because it is having some parallels to today. So I don't know. You can give me your thoughts if you want. Maybe you've thought one way or the other on this before. Or maybe you don't know what to make of it. But still, interesting guy to check out. And if you ever go to Harper's Ferry, you should definitely see the museum. So you all have a wonderful rest of the day. I'll see you tomorrow for Bible study. Peace out.